Well, hello and welcome to the Psychedelic Diaries. I am your host, Ray Christian, and do we have a show for you today? We will be joined momentarily by Chris Moreau, the CEO of Algernon Pharmaceuticals, for a deep dive and a soul search. As usual, let's dive in with a nugget and a noodle. And today's news nugget, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is now contemplating magic mushrooms. He is set to review a proposal for psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, for the medical indications, and yet another sign of psychedelics permeating our culture at the highest levels. And as for the noodle, something I've been noodling on of late, is where we could apply tax revenue for psychedelics. So for instance, cannabis revenue here in California has been a major source of funds for education. So whether it's psychedelics for medical indications and the revenue related to that, or perhaps tax revenue from a world with psychedelic dispensaries. Well, that's it for a nugget and a noodle. Producer Kevin, are we all properly synced up with Chris Moreau? We are. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may direct your attention to the left side of your screen, he is the CEO of Algernon Pharmaceuticals, Christopher Moreau. Thank you for joining the show.
You're very welcome, Ray. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Well, Chris, let's dive right in. So you are a capital markets guy, and I think it's always fascinating to see someone like yourself that has the ability to kind of have the finger in a bunch of different pies and live vicariously through a few industries say, no, I'm going all in on this one, on psychedelics. So I'm curious, what was it that was compelling you to make this shift and go to psychedelics?
Well, we have a significant investor who's sort of savvy with the market and what's going on in the market, and he reached out to me last November and said, "Are you looking at the psychedelic space?" And I said, I've got my hands full. We've got inventory drugs that we're advancing. And he said, "No, I really want you to have a look at it." And there's a lot of interest. And so I happened to get off the phone, and in my office was my chief science officer. And I said, "I want you to look at the psychedelic space." And he said, "You got to be kidding me. We've got our hands full." So he was repeating my story. But after a week or two, he came back and said, "Look, yes, there's lots of interest in psychedelics, but let's look at it from a true pharma play. Are there drugs that Algernon could look at that may have a therapeutic effect in a different way than they're currently being investigated, either for addiction or depression, PTSD?" And this CSO of mine had a background in stroke. And he immediately came upon some very exciting research that showed that psychedelic drugs can help brain neurons grow. And that was really the start of it. And a few months later, we announced that we were full bore in investigating dimethyltryptamine, which people should know as DMT. And be glad to share some of the key research, but it's really exciting. And I can't wait to find out just how effective it is helping people who've suffered a stroke.
Yes, and congrats on some of those key findings and for making the leap. It's good to see people in this industry that is really requiring you to be tip of the spear and a bit gutsy and ballsy to do so. So thank you for being one of these guys that's helping move the needle. And speaking of those findings, Chris at Algernon, I love the recent finding I read about where you have a sub-hallucinogenic dose of DMT that is proven now to increase neuron growth by 40% in rodents, which I think is a tremendous finding. And it's tough to prognosticate or extrapolate from rodents to humans, but obviously there's a reason we do that testing on rodents.
Yeah.
What do you think we can expect as the rodent studies graduate into human trials?
So I think what we can expect is, and maybe just to back up a bit, you've got 4 stages to getting a drug through. It might be helpful to talk a bit about that. You've got preclinical, where the drug doesn't leave the laboratory, so you're testing it on animals, you are synthesizing the compound, you're doing toxicity studies. Then you have a phase 1 where you're looking for the appropriate dose and also a safety signal. Is there toxicity in humans? Then you go into a phase 2 where you're actually testing it on the patient population you're wanting to treat. Phase 3 is a bigger phase 2. So what we would hope to see in our human studies is that this neuronal growth, first investigated by a researcher out of University of California, Davis, called Olson, where he took neurons, cortical neurons, so from the cortex of rats, and exposed the neurons to psychedelic compounds, LSD, DMT, amphetamine, and exposed them for 72 hours. And when they washed out the psychedelics and they were able to look at the neurons, they saw an increased density of growth. That was the first step that you start thinking, wow, that if it can help a neuron grow, could it help a stroke patient that suffered a deficit? You know, when you have a stroke, you've got an interruption of blood supply to brain tissue, the brain cells start to die. Could it help rewire the brain? And so another group of scientists took it further last year from Hungary, where they took a rat model for stroke. They tied off the blood supply to part of the brain. They provided some of the rats with DMT. Some control mice didn't receive anything. And at 30 days, the rats that got the DMT showed almost a full recovery and a dramatically smaller infarct area or dead cell area. So those are really the key 2 findings. And what you spoke about, I'm giving you some long answers here, Ray. We actually investigated that for ourselves because we can look to others and their science, but we want to be able to say we validated it. So we ran our own study, and yes, at a 30 nanomolar concentration, that's a very small dose, it would translate into man, we found that the neurons did increase by 40% in terms of the connectivity. And there's ways that they measure those neurons. So one final point, we are looking at a sub-psychedelic dose of DMT for patients, because if you've had a stroke, it's not really helpful to be sending them on a paradigm shifting experience. In fact, some drugs have failed because they're cause you to hallucinate. So it's the sub-psychedelic dose we're interested in.
Thank you for that layman's terms translation. And I think you're right on that point. I've heard, for instance, that oftentimes psychedelics can help the rigid brain, for instance, perhaps the depressed brain or the anxious brain, and it gets it to be in a more neuroplastic state. But on the other hand, if you have schizophrenic patients, their brains essentially are already too neuroplastic. And so making them more so is not going to help. And that stroke analogy is useful to hear why the sub-hallucinogenic approach would be useful. And I'm curious, you talk about cortical neuron growth and there's 40% increase. And I love the fact that you guys did it yourself. You said, hold on, we want to verify it in-house. The findings are fascinating and the implications are far reaching. For the average person, maybe it's someone that hasn't had a stroke yet, or maybe someone that's completely new to psychedelics or brain science. What are the implications for the layman of neuron growth? Is it better cognition, better memory, rebuilding the brain, regulation of emotions? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great line of questions, because when you see this data, you start to think to yourself, could DMT make you a smarter person? Could you read faster? Can you process data more quickly? And I think all of these things need to be investigated. The effects of DMT or psychedelics for treating depression and PTSD and addiction, I think that's well on its way. And in our case, you have to sort of pick a spot and start to drill down. And so we're focused on really the specific, what happens to brain cells when they're starved of oxygen, which is a result of a stroke. And it seems that after the stroke, within a few weeks or months, the brain is really trying to figure out how to reconnect, how to bridge dead area of cells. And these are done with synapses and these neutrites, these dendritic spines. When you look at some of the images of these cortical neurons and their growth, they sort of look like the bottom end of a plant you've pulled out of the soil. You've got all
Mm.
of these roots connected. And so the for us, the excitement is, can we help heal the brain? And what's exciting, I think, about DMT or psychedelic drugs for injury, brain injury, is that it's a different method than previously drugs, and hundreds of them have failed, trying to help reduce the damage as it's occurring or close to the time it's happening in the brain. But we're looking at this from a view that injury has happened or is happening. Can we help the brain heal? And that's our focus. So that might help explain a little better to a layperson just what's the drug doing inside the brain. And one other point, scientists really work hard for some drugs to get it into the brain. We have what's known as the blood-brain barrier. This is a special
Yes.
lining to the vessels that go through your brain, trying to keep toxins out of your brain. So biochemists are tricky. They have to play with compounds to get them to be able to be absorbed into the brain. We know that because it's a serotonin-like receptor, that's the activity, that DMT gets into the brain. So it's neuronal. And now once it's in the brain, we have a better understanding, or we're trying to figure out what is it doing and why is it helping? Why could it help people? We know it's helping the animals, but we're not there yet on people.
It's certainly a good harbinger, and I appreciate that explanation. And this fundamental so what of, can we heal the brain? I think it's something that it reminds me of that parable of two fish swimming along, and one fish swims by and says, "Hey, morning, boys, how's the water?" And he swims off, and then one of the young fish turns to the other and says, "What's water?" And when we think about our own brains, it's tough to think about them. Like we understand a broken wrist or ankle, or even a hampered one or a strained calf. But to think that our brains don't go through the same type of trauma and issues it's a silly thought, because of course it does. But it's tough to conceptualize what that actually looks like. And so this cortical neuron growth and healing it and connecting these dead areas, I think, can really start to help people understand what the implications are for these treatments. And speaking of the healthy people and the stroke patients, you're also focused at Algernon on IPF and chronic cough. What led you to these three focuses?
Well, so Algernon's a drug repurposing company. So we don't advance new chemical entities through to approval. That can take 13 years and 500 million to a few billion. We specialize in trying to find new uses for older, safer drugs. So drug repurposing, because of COVID, we know about hydrochloroquine and remdesivir. These were antivirals originally targeting different viruses. And investigators were looking to say, hey, maybe there's similar mechanisms of action or targets. Could they help in COVID? And so our science program, we take a look at certain compounds. They're off patent. We look at their mechanism and their target. We think through why it might help work on another disease. Now, most of us don't realize that drugs are polypharma. They have these multiple effects in our body. We tend to think of them more as side effects, negative. Take a drug for a rash, it causes an upset stomach or makes you dizzy. But it could also be helping you heal in different ways. But that's not intuitive. It needs to be studied. So we have research programs in place that are looking at older compounds. We investigate them in new animal studies to see if they could treat a new disease. And then if they do, we move them quickly into human trials. So it's called drug repurposing, and it's a very cost-effective way to advance compounds and drugs.
And so for the uninitiated, this concept of off-patent compounds and repurposing, and this approach of saying, no, we're not going to create our brand new patents. We're going to take a current compound we know and reapply it. Does the IP essentially come from the indication and the specific application of that already known compound?
Great question. So there are multiple IP or patent strategies. A typical one is called method of use. So you'd say that this compound, we're now patenting it to treat kidney disease and no one else can touch that. Or you can do a formulation patent. Maybe you're changing the formulation. Was it IV? Now it's oral. Maybe it's slow release. You can also have a dose patent. That's another twist. You can slightly change the structure of the drug. These biochemists are pretty smart. And so you have a derivative or an analog of the original drug, and you can get another 20 years. And finally, you can rely on some regulatory protection, at least 5 years with a new drug in the US FDA where no one else can genericize it. If it's an orphan indication, which means very small number of people suffer from that disease, then you have 8 years protection in Europe and the US. So a number of different patent strategies. You need the IP protection to justify the investment needed to research the drug and try to move it forward.
I appreciate that explanation. That's helpful to see the different paths. Sometimes I think that this is like the Wild West here in psychedelics, and makes me think of the Littlefinger Game of Thrones quote of chaos is a ladder. And I'm curious for you, where we don't really know what's going to happen at the regulatory level, both in US, Canada, UK, and Europe. Where are we going to have decriminalization? Is it going to be medical use? Will there be full legalization? Let's go the full bore, because you got very specific use cases and medical indications. And I think there's always going to be a path for that. And I'm kind of curious about how the medical use cases can overlap with, if it does go recreational, what does that look like, and how both can help perhaps. But to simplify the question, what does it look like for you, for Algernon, if we do achieve legalization?
Well, I think it won't. You and I chatted earlier before we started recording that if there's general awareness building, that helps everybody. For us, it's all evidence-based. And so we believe that if we have the evidence with rigorous testing and clinical trials that shows that DMT helps stroke patients either recover quickly during the stroke or shortly thereafter, or helps them reduce the deficit they might be suffering from, there is a very specific path for us to have it approved in a clinical setting. You know, DMT is a restricted substance, but so is morphine. And there are many restricted drugs that are approved under certain labels and certain conditions. I think that the general population, let's go to our politicians, they're just people like you and I. They have their own fears. You know, probably the greatest fear is you're going to have mayhem. You're going to have criminal response, people out of their minds, literally. But my personal view is that all of these new potential treatments or therapies, even experiences, should be openly investigated with an open mind, and that we shouldn't let that fear step in the way of science. And if experiencing a psychedelic drug gets you to think differently about your life or your relationships or what life's all about, and it actually can cause that a change and a shift, we should be looking at this thing, at these compounds aggressively, never mind having to fight for years. So I would hope that, you know, what's important is safe supply, not having access, or, you know, you want to have access to these compounds and now you're taking personal risk to do it. You don't know what you're ingesting or what you're smoking or what you're, you know, as this becomes more formal, as approvals roll out, and if it starts for medicinal or therapeutic purposes and that goes into the clinic, I think it's just a matter of time where the fear will start to sort of dissipate like a fog. People will start to see more clearly and will be way more open to think about these compounds.
What a beautiful way of putting it, this fear dissipating like a fog. And you made me think of my own personal experience of when you said, don't let fear get in the way of the science, because what I did for a while, Chris, was once a month full doses. And what I looked at it as was I was basically experimenting on myself like a 1940s scientist. Yeah. And it was scary actually each time, believe it or not, even when I got into the dozens and 80th and 90th time, and it was still a little bit of fear. And I think to myself, if I had some trepidation even then, what would the normal person be like again when it's their first time or second? And one particular experience I had, Chris, that I think is relevant to what you're doing at Algernon is, so just to set the stage, you can do large doses or hero doses, and you won't always have a transcendent experience. Sometimes it's just, you see lessons, you learn, you get the neuroplasticity, but you don't get what I would call pulled into the fifth dimension, or you don't have an interaction with God. And I had probably 6 or 7 of the transcendent experiences, and then I went dozens without them. And I figured, okay, I guess there's just no more of those.
Mm-hmm.
And then one happened. And I call it the rebirth, because what happened, Chris, and it's tough to put into words, but I felt like I got pulled. It was on psilocybin, but it reminded me of how people describe DMT, where I feel like I got smashed through dimensions, many of them. And I opened up my consciousness opened up into this more than 3-dimensional state. And I was taught things and saw things about the universe and the nature of our existence that at that time I could grasp in this multi-dimensional pure consciousness state. But and the ride getting smashed into these various dimensions was quite simply just thrilling and like nothing else I've ever seen. And yet when I got pulled back and I kind of collapsed down into this human state, all these dimensions folded in like a tesseract in a Matthew McConaughey Interstellar type ending scene, it was as if I was quite literally a newborn baby. Mm-hmm. And I was there at the time with my girlfriend, and I don't know what happened while I was off in these dimensions, but when I came back, she said I had been moaning and for a while and kind of making loud noises, which I had no recollection of. But when I came back and when I came to, it was as if just like you would picture a baby that has just been pulled out of the womb. I couldn't make eye contact. I had these googly eyes. I couldn't talk. I had my motor functions were diminished, and which was just a fascinating, for the first few minutes, a little bit scary experience. And it quickly started coming to, and all my old neural paths started firing off. But the best way I could describe it is that I had a brand new brain, or maybe it had just gone through a deep car wash cleaning. And it made me think of how you described the DMT
or a reboot, or a reboot. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm curious, Chris, for you, about your personal journey with psychedelics. Have you had an experience?
You know, it's a good question, and you and I talked a bit about this earlier. We actually have a lead consultant who's a neuropsychopharmacologist, David Nutt from the UK. And when we retained him as a consultant, he and I ran an interview, and the interviewer couldn't wait to ask him, you know, Dr. Nutt, have you taken DMT or any of the psychedelic drugs? And he said, I'm not answering that question. And he said, it's and it's not about me. And he's a professor, and he worked for the UK government, setting policy on legalization. And so I didn't ask him later, but I thought to myself, in his sense, I think he doesn't want to personalize it because it can muddle things. And so in talking to you today, I have to remember that I am here as the CEO of Algernon Pharmaceuticals. And while there's always a sense of who I am as a person, I'm really representing Algernon. And I'm not making any comment on psychedelic compounds. I mean, the fact is, as the CEO, I've embraced and am driving our ship to investigate these far lands, the lands of psychedelic drugs, with an openness and with an anticipation that they, in fact, we could unlock the science behind them, and they could be very helpful. So I don't have any personal experiences to share. I've listened with interest the experience you had, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be exciting for people because what you've described could be also cause a lot of fear with people who were going through that. And if they hadn't done it before, and are they going to come out of it? And if you have a guide, and if you have people can read about how the compound works, how it clears the body. As an example, DMT has a half-life of about 8 minutes. So it's got a very short window of experience. Then all of this information can help people experience these compounds. And it sounded like you had a positive experience, and that's what you would hope for everyone.
Yes, and I appreciate the diplomatic and objective and perhaps a little bit of cloak and dagger response. Maybe I flapped my gums about the experience enough for everybody on today's show. Speaking of you being the CEO of Algernon, last question on this deep dive, Chris. What are you excited about What's coming down the pipeline that's got your engine revved a bit?
Well, what I'm excited about is that we're going to be running a phase 1 study for DMT in healthy patients at Hammersmith Medicines in the UK as early as January of 2022. That's our plan. Sometimes if you're moving a drug through, you might be worried that you have a safety issue in phase 1, which could kill your program. There have been numerous phase 1 studies on DMT. Dr. Rick Strassman, the father of the phrase, the spirit molecule, who's also part of our scientific and advisory board, he did his work in the 80s and 90s. Hammersmith Medicine just did a phase 1 for small pharma on DMT. So we're not concerned at all about safety, which means that we could be in a phase 2 trial where we're actually exposing patients that have had a stroke to DMT as early as the summer. So that's really exciting to think that we could be on the verge of a discovery that will have a global impact on mankind. That's the exciting part of Algernon's business.
Well put. Global impact on mankind, I think, is relevant here. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the hyperbole with psychedelics, but it feels warranted. Chris, that was a very fun deep dive. We got to transition, producer Kevin, to the soul search. Chris, what is a lesson that either your father or your mother taught you?
Treat everybody like you want to be treated. Everyone is from the same source.
That's good. Question number 2, Chris. What would you rather have? Somebody's attention or their curiosity?
I think I'd rather have their curiosity.
I'm with you on that. Okay, question number 3, Chris. What one person has had a tremendous impact on your career?
My dad, I would say. He was an entrepreneur and so many nuances, people skills, and galore. And I would say my dad, hands down.
That's a fun one. Okay, number 4 and final question, Chris. What are you personally most proud of from the last 10 years?
I think I'm most proud of the work that the team Algernon group has done on our COVID-19 trial. One of our compounds showed some potential that it might have helped the very sickest of sick COVID patients. And in a very short time frame, we did an international study. The drug wasn't as helpful as we had thought, but the whole team did an amazing job. And I'm proud of the work we did as a company for COVID-19.
Oh, very good. Topical and relevant. So that's it for the Soul Search. That was a fascinating deep dive into your background. Thank you for sharing, Chris. Last thing, what would you ask of the viewers and listeners, or is there an action item?
I think that I would just ask for everyone to keep a very open mind about the potential of compounds like DMT, and to stop off and visit if they're interested in learning more about Algernon. I think we're doing very important work, and the more people that know about Algernon, the better for everyone. So that would be my ask of today's audience.
And perhaps explore an investment opportunity. That came from me, not from him. We'll get the links in the description for the Algernon homepage. Chris, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me, Ray. Appreciated the time.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. Thank you to Chris Moreau, CEO of Algernon Pharmaceuticals. Thank you to producer Kevin. Of course, I'm Ray Christian. See you next time.